With their hard-won, well-deserved fighting reputation, our United States Marines carry forward another solid tradition for pride in appearance. Plenty of good spirit and hard work, spit and polish, and kept it up. In the early days of the Republic, even personal funds were spent to maintain that tradition, which has now lasted almost 180 years. Our Marine uniform has always been distinctive, but some of the eye-catching outfits years ago were pretty impractical. For instance, to maintain those light-colored pantaloons in the old days before there were cleaning and pressing shops, powdered whiting was issued. There was powder for the hair, too. No quick slick with a comb would do. Every man, the regulation said, must appear on parade with hair powdered and queued. Permitting the men to have hair powder, by which is only meant flour, said the commandant, instills pride in them and a habit of cleanliness. So we find an old order for 1 barrel of sour flour for powdering to be delivered to the Marine Barracks, Washington. The Private Joe of those days had a rough time when he got caught in the rain with his hair full of sour flour. And how could a man hold on to one of those high-crowned hats in a gale? But if he lost his, $2 came out of his hard-earned $7 monthly pay to buy another. Coats were a bit more practical. The first ones were green, the earliest predecessors of today's greens. Those early coats had white facings, then later red, and by 1798, blue and scarlet took over. In those sailing ship days, few Americans were seen overseas, so it was especially important that Marines who went ashore be dressed as well as the smartest soldiers of Europe. Uniform styles often followed those of the most successful army of the moment. So it was that the high style of Napoleon's army brought the most colorful uniform in Corps history to our Marines in 1804. Officers wore a large, flat-sided fore and aft chapeau de bras, topped with a scarlet plume and cocked over the right eye. The coat, navy blue, had tails turned back to reveal a red lining. A bold scarlet sash, saber, tight-fitting white pantaloons, the famous black leather stock, and black leather boots completed the outfit. The enlisted man's coatee was crossed by white belts, and gaiters were of black cloth. The pantaloons were tight-fitting, and there was a brass-trimmed black shako topped by a red plush plume. But in spite of all the tinsel and tassels, this tough fighting Marine cut a bold swath through the enemy and gave the Corps the beginning of its proud battle heritage. On the shores of Tripoli, and later in the 1812 war with the British. When peace was restored, the officers had time to think about less important matters, like the high cost of uniforms. One of those fancy rigs cost more than the outfit of an Army Major General. So 8 lieutenants, badly in debt, gathered their courage and wrote to the commandant. And in 1820, a change was made. The junior officers got their long wished-for short single-breasted jackets, loose pantaloons worn over the boots, and shako. That change didn't last long. President Andrew Jackson in 1827 revived the green uniform, but it was difficult to keep the dye from fading, so greens were dropped again in a couple of years. By Civil War times, there was still another new style, very impressive as always. Marine John Fred wrote of those days, "While on liberty in Washington, we were frequently taken for brigadier generals by the volunteers." But one feature had not changed in nearly 100 years, the black leather stock from which came the famous Marine name, Leathernecks. Popular legend, not well supported by history, says these stocks served as protection in the early battles of sword, saber, and cutlass. On a cruise in the South Atlantic in 1875, the rats aboard the ship Monongahela got into the supply of leather stocks and so damaged them that all had to be thrown overboard. Incidents like this one led to the end of the leather stock. But we had no trouble teaching Marines to hold their heads high without the stocks, a general reported. The uniform kept on changing. When Bismarck's Prussian army was the most powerful in Europe, the spiked helmet was adopted for a while as part of our Marine dress uniform. From the formality of spiked helmets, we moved about the time of the Spanish-American War to the much-loved, very informal campaign hat. It allowed for much expression of individuality. Too much, some people said. Just before World War I, green came back for the first time since Jackson's day, being adopted for the winter uniform. Those greens are still standard today, although in 1928, that token of the old leather stock, the high standing collar, was abolished in all uniforms except the dress, blues, and whites. But whether it's greens or blues or tans, throughout its proud history, the Corps has always turned out trim, precise, and ready. And with that great background behind him, today's fighting Marine carries forward that fine tradition for pride in appearance.
The kid's name is Barney Ross, and his mother and his father came from Russia. He grew up in a Chicago ghetto on the wrong side of the tracks. The wrong side of the stockyards, where you have to fight your way down the street if you want to take a walk. He came up the hard way. He was one of the Golden Glove kids. In New York in the spring of 1934, he took on a fight with Jimmy McLarnin and carried off the world's welterweight championship. The first fighter in the world to hold both light and welterweight crowns.
Make a no welterweight champion.
He was never a fighter who kept his titles in mothballs. Garcia, Patrol, Giannazzo, and Armstrong, he faced the best fighters of his time and held the crown for 4 years.
The winner and still champion, Ross.
He quit the ring in 1938. But in 1943, the Boxing Writers Association gave him the award for the man who did most for the sport that year. Comeback? Yeah, he made a comeback. But he wasn't in trunks and gloves. He was wearing the fatigues of a buck private in the U.S. Marines. His name is Barney Ross. Here he is.
What's your job now? Let's quit a while, Barney. I'm pooped.
Okay, kid.
Say, Barney, I want to tell you.
Hey, jerk.
Yeah?
Sergeant Barney Ross to you. Private?
Yeah, sure. Say, Barney, how did you make sergeant?
Easy. First, you make corporal.
Well, how do you do that? I've been bucking for 6 months and nothing happened.
Really want to know?
Yeah, sure.
I guess there are a lot of ways of doing it, but I know just one. You take a boat to Guadalcanal and go in with the Marines. Hang around offshore while the Navy guns soften up the coast defenses. Then go over the side into the landing boats. I enlisted in April and was out in the jungle in September. That's pretty quick, but that's the way I wanted it. I had been rattling around ever since I quit boxing. I like to get around to where the show was, and this looked like the biggest show on earth. The road work on the island was nothing like the road work at Grossinger's, where I used to train. We used to get all baseball scores and fight returns over the radio, and we did a lot of betting. That was the only part of it that was anything like Jacobs Beach. There weren't any showers around. We went 15 days without washing and changing our socks, and any creek looked good. Of course, if you come from the west side in Chicago like I do, you know a lot about jungle fighting, infighting, cover and concealment, long before you see a jungle or a Jap. And coming from a neighborhood like that, and getting around the way I did, gives you plenty to fight for. Fighting in the ring is kid stuff compared to the fighting out there. Guadalcanal, it was a fight to the finish with no holds barred and no referee to break up the clinches. My company of Marines was spearheading the attack for a big army push over the Matanicow River, about 5 miles northwest of Henderson Field. I spent one night out there I'll never forget. A lot of guys have been through the same thing. We got stuck in a mortar crater, 5 wounded leathernecks, 2 soldiers and myself. The Japs weren't many yards away. They set up machine guns before the army behind us could dig in. I lobbed over some grenades at them, and as all the other boys were wounded, I emptied my own rifle and also fired theirs. The Japs never stopped firing all night. That night was by all odds the toughest round I have ever slugged through. For 10 days I had complete loss of memory from the pounding of the mortar. Anyhow, when I came to, they told me I was a corporal.
I hear you shot 22 Japs that night, Barney.
Yeah.
How about that being recommended for the Silver Star? When do you get it?
Well, I received it several days ago, but I accepted it only on behalf of my entire company. You know, this isn't a one-man's war.
Unfurled to every breeze from the dawn to setting sun. We have fought in every clime and place where we could take a gun. In the snow of far-off northern lands and in sunny tropic scenes, you will find us always on the job, the United States Marine.
We fought for life and never lost
is Guam. Less than 1,600 miles from Tokyo and Manila, the largest of the Mariana Islands was still a vital guardian of Japan's sea lanes in the summer of 1944. When Saipan fell, Guam was next on our schedule of attack. Guam had been the first American possession to fall to the Japanese. Now, our convoys were steaming toward the Japs' Mariana stronghold in preparation of its capture. And meanwhile, we shelled and bombed Guam's coastal installations. Because the original invasion date, June 16th, had to be postponed, our first premature barrage had been kept up continuously for 17 days, the longest pre-invasion bombardment to occur in this theater. Our aircraft came to bomb and strafe the Jap positions. They dropped 400 tons of explosives, and in their strafing runs fired several 100,000 rounds of ammunition. The invasion plan called for 2 simultaneous assaults, north and south of Opera Harbor, one by the 3rd Marine Division, the other by the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade, reinforced by the 77th Infantry Division. D-Day was set for 21st July. At 8 o'clock that morning, men of the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade and later of the 77th Infantry prepared to land in the southern sector after a final 2 hours pounding of Guam's west coast. They were expecting rough going. They knew that the island shores were studded with coral reef, that Guam was powerfully fortified, and that at all costs the Japs would try to hold on. But by early afternoon, Major General Bruce, commander of the 77th Infantry Division, was ready to move his troops inland. The landings were almost unopposed, so successful had been the pre-invasion bombardment. And in the northern sector, the 3rd Marine Division invaded. At 8:20, the first troops landed. Then, 15 minutes later, the Japs attacked with mortar fire. They struck some amphibian tanks, but they didn't damage a single transport, nor did they hold up our schedule. Our naval guns thundered in reply. 19 warships fired a stream of shells right over the assault waves. Some men had to wade ashore from stranded amphibians. On land, because of Jap artillery, Marines had to dig in and wait until some hours later the enemy concentrations were destroyed by air attacks. Then the Marines moved on through charred and tattered palm groves. After 10,000 tons of bombs and shells, the enemy still had guns and fight. And here in jungles, swamps, and mountain caves, he was going to make his stand. By early evening, the men had crossed the Assam River and reached their first objective. The day was over, but the mortar fire went on. This was Friday night, the beginning of a furious weekend in the Central Pacific. Now that 2 beachheads were firmly established, our next objectives were a juncture of forces and the control of Opera Harbor. The 3rd Marines were to move down, capturing Piti and Cabras Island, the harbor's northern border. The 1st Provisional Marines were to move up toward Orote Peninsula, the southern border. But first, on Saturday at dawn, Jap troops counterattacked from the Chonito Cliffs. Our tanks and buffaloes, as well as naval and aerial gunfire, supported our troops who beat them back, though they had driven far into our outposts. And while the Japs resisted savagely from caves along the cliff, another contingent of the 3rd Marines fought their way southward. Our troops and infantry tank teams were supported by mortar fire from the rear, and by Sunday morning had reached both Cabras Island and Piti. There they found more evidence of the furor of our 17-day bombardment. This was all that had left of Piti town, and our troops and mortars had done the rest. No building, no natives, no Japs. In the south, one section of the troops were pushing north, while another on Saturday had started a drive east toward Mount Alifan. To protect their advance across an open plain,
Machine guns first sprayed the area. Fortunately, Japanese resistance was weak. By Sunday night, Mount Alifan was ours. On the following day, the troops going north reached the base of Orote Peninsula, and on Tuesday, they established contact with the northern forces. A 12-mile coastline was now consolidated as we prepared for the next day's attack on the last Japanese stronghold on this coast, Orote. For some, the fighting was over. 2,366 men had been wounded, and for every 5 Japs killed, 1 American had died. 443 in all, and 109 were missing. The seriously wounded were on their way to a hospital ship. For others, the worst was still to come. Howitzers were set up at the peninsula's base, and as a precaution against surprise attacks, trenches were dug where the troops waited for the signal to attack. Wednesday morning, shortly before the jump-off point at 0700 hours, aerial attacks and naval fire hit at the strongly defended Jap mortar and artillery positions. The attack went on for 3 whole days. With machine gun fire, the Marines broke through the Japs' forward defenses, fought their way through dense jungle undergrowth against desperate resistance, and finally blasted the Japs out of their dugouts with dynamite packs and hand grenades. On Saturday, 8 days after the invasion, Orote's airfield was ours. The U.S. Marines had returned to a base where their own barracks had stood before Pearl Harbor, and which by their own guns had now been reduced to this. We controlled our coastline now, Mount Tanyo and Mount Alifan. Next came the capture of Guam's capital, Agana. The attack was set for Monday, the 31st, D-Day plus 10. The 3rd Marines and 77th Infantry Division moved abreast. There was little resistance. The Japs had retreated and in the process set up roadblocks and barbed wire in Agana's outskirts. These barriers were ineffective. Even landmines did not hold us up for long. By 6 o'clock in the afternoon, we had entered the capital. 11,000 Chamaros, amiable, sleepy native Guamanians had lived here before the war. Long ago, they had been seized by the Japs or had fled to the hills, and now, save for an isolated Jap sniper, Agana's ruins were utterly deserted. At the same time, troops headed for Pago Bay on the east coast to split the island in 2. Resistance was weak, but the mountain terrain was tough. There was no time to build roads, and the men had to carry much of the artillery ammunition themselves. Brigadier General Noble of the 3rd Marine Division watching the troops' progress at a forward command post. Reconnaissance patrols set out to probe the area south of the splitting line. To their surprise, they found no sign of the Japs. The enemy had evacuated his troops to the north and proposed to defend the island from there. All the patrols found in that region were the bodies of Guamanian natives, bodies without heads. For each time a native had turned his head toward the sky and looked for our liberating airplanes, the Japs in their hysteria had decapitated him. Now, our task was to squeeze the Japs toward the northern tip of Guam. On August 6th, the 3rd week of the invasion, one flank of the 77th started its drive toward Mount Santa Rosa. At the base of the mountain, our artillery hammered at the entrenched Japs before more troops were able to move up. On the other side of the island, the 3rd Marine Division had driven northeast from Agana toward another airfield. Again, they encountered little opposition, and on the 2nd of August, 2 days after our entry into the capital, the airfield's capture was complete. These planes might have killed hundreds of our men. Thanks to our thorough bombardment, they never had a chance to take off. Communication lines were quickly thrown forward, while the field itself was being reconstructed by Seabees. Before long, we were launching aerial assaults on other Mariana Islands as well as Guam itself. The Marines swept on northwestwards to Finigayong. Here and there, a sniper might be left, but otherwise the village was as empty as had been Piti, Cabras Island, and Agana. The troops in the east kept up with this fast northward push. They were now making for Patti Point, the island's very tip. This was the last stretch. Guam had been the first South Sea island to be visited by a white man, and since 1898 had been in American hands. Now, after the years of devastating Jap occupation, it would once more belong to us in a few more days. But first the fighting became fiercer. All the surviving Japs had been driven to this small corner in the north, from where they were determined to resist to the last man rather than surrender. The push went on and on. This jungle-infested island, a tiny speck on the map, is in reality the size of San Francisco. Quickly as our troops had overrun Guam, it wasn't an easy job. We had to flush out the last desperate Japs who had stubbornly dug themselves into huge caves near Patti Point. In one cave alone, we found between 300 and 400 charred Japanese. This was the end. On 10th August, exactly 3 weeks after D-Day, all organized resistance ceased. More than 22,000 civilian natives had found refuge with the American troops. They were given medical aid before returning to their homes and farms. The natives had suffered greatly under our attack, but they welcomed us as liberators and presented us with an American flag, which, made by their own hands, had come from their hearts. We paid our price. This man no longer had a face which would identify him. We had to bury 1,289 American men. 5,648 were wounded. 148 were missing. The Japs had lost more than 10,000. But we were now almost 3/4 of the way to Tokyo. The first American possession to be taken by the Japanese had become our first great air and naval base, far out in the Pacific. A new Pearl Harbor, 4,000 miles closer to the war, from which to launch our flying fortresses against the homeland of the enemy.